Welcome back to the front lines of justice. Today we're following the deployment of Heidi, a decorated logistics officer and tactical analyst who spent years surviving the heat of Iraq and the mountains of Afghanistan. But her most dangerous ambush didn't happen in a combat zone. It happened at a dinner table in Bryn Mawr. Betrayed by her husband and sister, and mocked by her elite in-laws for being too rigid and unrefined, she was evicted from the very life her combat pay had funded. They thought they were discarding a broken soldier. They didn't realize they were handing a master strategist the blueprints to their own destruction. They wanted a war? They just got a commander. Lock and load. Here is her story. The crystal chandeliers of the Bryn Mawr mansion hung like frozen tears from the vaulted ceiling, casting a sharp, unforgiving glow over the dinner table. I sat there in my dress blues, the fabric of my uniform feeling stiff and alien against the backdrop of silk drapes and expensive floral arrangements. I had only been back from training for 48 hours, and the scent of gunpowder and North Carolina dust still felt like it was etched into my pores. A stark contrast to the cloying, sweet aroma of lilies that filled the room. Logan was sitting right next to me, his hand resting over mine under the table. It was a gesture that should have felt like an anchor after months away, but as his fingers brushed against my skin, I realized his touch was devoid of warmth. It was as cold as the chilled champagne sitting in the silver buckets. I looked around the room at the 20 members of my extended family, all dressed in their finest attire, their faces illuminated by the soft flicker of candlelight. I actually believed this was for me. I thought this dinner was a homecoming, a rare moment where the pride of the main line would stop to acknowledge the woman who had spent her life serving a cause greater than the family crest. I thought Susan, my mother-in-law, was standing up to offer a toast to my service. I was so incredibly wrong. It wasn't a celebration. It was a court-martial without the benefit of a defense. Susan smoothed the front of her designer dress, her smile as polished and artificial as the pearls around her neck. She didn't look at me as she raised her glass. Her eyes were fixed on the far end of the table, where my younger sister, Margaret, sat. "We have a strategic adjustment to announce this evening," Susan said, her voice cutting through the air like a razor blade through silk. She spoke with the practiced ease of a woman who was used to moving people like pieces on a boardroom map. She didn't pause, didn't hesitate, as she informed the room that Margaret would be stepping into a new role within the family. My heart skipped a beat, then began to hammer against my ribs in a rhythm I recognized from live fire drills. But this wasn't a drill. Susan announced that Margaret, the sister I had protected and shielded since we were children, was going to become the new daughter-in-law of the household. The air left my lungs in a sharp gasp. I felt Logan's hand slide away from mine, his fingers retreating as if he had been touching something contaminated. He didn't look at me either. He turned his gaze toward Margaret with an expression of such longing that it felt like a physical blow to my chest. They weren't just announcing a divorce, they were announcing a merger. A corporate alliance, Susan called it. I looked around the table, searching for a single face that shared my shock, but all I saw was a sea of knowing nods and polite smiles. They all knew. While I was sweating on the firing range and leading my unit through the mud, my own blood and the man I had married were planning to dismantle my life. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. My fingers, calloused from years of handling heavy machinery and weapons, felt clumsy as they gripped the stem of my crystal water glass. I watched as my hand began to shake, a betrayal of the discipline I had spent my entire adult life building. The glass slipped, crashing against the white marble floor with a sound that felt like an explosion in the quiet room. Shards of crystal scattered like diamonds across the floor, and a small trail of red began to seep from a cut on my finger. But the sting of the wound was nothing compared to the look of pure disdain Susan leveled at me. She didn't offer a napkin or a word of concern. Instead, she sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. "This is exactly what I mean," she said, her voice dripping with a condescending pity that made my skin crawl. "Your career, Heidi, it has made you so crude. You've lost that touch of refinement, that soft power that Logan needs in his world. You're more comfortable in a trench than a ballroom. And frankly, my son deserves a woman who doesn't smell like a motor pool." Every word was a direct strike on my identity. a dismissal of everything I had sacrificed for the sake of duty. I looked at Margaret, hoping for a shred of remorse, but she was radiant. She was wearing a silk dress I'd helped her pick out, and on her finger, catching the light, was the very ring I had helped Logan pay for. It was a trophy, a symbol of the life they had stolen while I was looking the other way. "How long?" I asked, my voice a low, jagged rasp that I barely recognized. I fought to keep my shoulders from trembling, trying to summon the stoicism of a soldier even as my world crumbled. Margaret didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, her eyes meeting mine, with a terrifying calmness. "We've been negotiating the compatibility of our futures for several months now, Heidi," she said. The word compatibility felt like a slur, a sanitized way to describe a betrayal of this magnitude. Logan finally looked up, his face set in a mask of practiced regret. He used grand, flowery words to justify his cowardice, calling me too rigid, too unyielding. He talked about his career and his needs, as if my life and my sacrifices were just footnotes in his story. I realized then that I was a hurdle they had finally decided to jump over. I stood up, my posture straight and tall. The muscle memory of an officer taking over even as I felt like a hollow shell of ash inside. I didn't say another word. There was nothing left to say to people who viewed loyalty as a disposable asset. I walked out of that mansion, leaving behind the laughter and the clinking of glasses. As I stepped out into the cold night air of Philadelphia, I felt the crushing weight of a different kind of defeat. I had survived deployments and combat, but nothing could have prepared me for the feeling of being abandoned by my own platoon in the middle of a dinner party. I was alone on a battlefield I didn't even know I was fighting on. The cold air of a Philadelphia winter has a way of seeping into your bones and staying there, much like the memories I have tried so hard to bury. As I walked away from that glowing mansion in Bryn Mawr, the silence of the night felt heavy, mirroring the weight I had carried since I was a little girl. I found myself thinking back to the Christmases of my childhood, those postcard-perfect mornings where the living room was filled with the scent of pine and the rustle of expensive wrapping paper. I can still see Margaret's face, illuminated by the tree lights, as she unwrapped one porcelain doll after another, followed by silk dresses that cost more than my father's monthly mortgage. When it was my turn, I was handed a plain, second-hand notebook and a pat on the shoulder. My mother would lean in and whisper that I was the big sister, that I had to be the responsible one, and that my joy should come from seeing Margaret happy. It was a lesson in self-effacement that I learned far too well. They dressed their neglect in the fine robes of duty, calling it the older sister's responsibility. And I was foolish enough to believe them. I grew up like a wild shrub in the cracks of the pavement, surviving on whatever scraps of attention were left over, while Margaret was a hothouse flower, nurtured and protected from even the slightest breeze. That belief, that my value was tied to how much I could sacrifice for others, became the very foundation of my life, a foundation they would later use to trap me. Why was I always the one who had to give everything up? That question haunted me as I remembered the day I turned 22. I didn't join the military just out of a sense of patriotism or a desire to see the world. I signed those papers because Margaret had spiraled into a mountain of credit card debt that threatened to pull the whole family under. While my peers were finishing college and starting careers, I was in basic training, pushing my body to the breaking point so I could send every cent of my enlistment bonus home to clear her name. For the next 4 years, whether I was in the blistering heat of Iraq or the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, my paycheck never stayed in my pocket. I ate rations out of a pouch and slept on a thin cot in a plywood hut so that Logan could sit in an air-conditioned library at his elite MBA program, wearing tailored wool suits that my combat pay provided. I thought I was building a future for us, a solid ground where we could finally stand together as equals. In reality, I was just a silent engine, fueled by my own exhaustion, powering a lifestyle for people who viewed me as nothing more than a convenient resource. Whenever I returned home on leave, the contrast was a physical ache. I would arrive with sand still in my gear and new scars etched into my skin, only to be met with Susan's thin, judgmental gaze. She would look at my tanned, weathered face and my rough, calloused hands with a quiet sort of disgust, as if I were a piece of machinery that had spent too much time in the rain. She would spend the entire dinner praising Margaret's soft, delicate features and her intuitive grasp of social graces, calling my strength a lack of refinement. Even my own mother joined in the chorus, telling me I should try to be more like my sister, that a woman shouldn't be so unyielding or tough. They never asked about the nights I spent awake on guard duty or the friends I lost. To them, my service was a crude necessity, a dirty job that allowed them to keep their own hands clean and their lives beautiful. I was the shield they used to block out the harsh realities of the world, and once the danger passed, they were more than happy to toss the shield aside because it didn't match the decor. The most bitter realization, however, didn't come from their words, but from a piece of jewelry. Standing there in the dark after that disastrous dinner, the image of the diamond ring on Margaret's finger kept flashing in my mind like a strobe light. It was a beautiful, clear stone that I recognized instantly. It was the gift I'd funded for our 5-year anniversary. Logan had told me at the time that the jeweler had made a mistake with the setting, that it was the wrong grade of diamond, and that he had returned it for a refund. I believed him because I loved him, and I watched that money disappear back into our shared account, only to have it vanish again into one of his many business ventures. Seeing it on my sister's hand was the final, undeniable proof that I had been paying for my own betrayal. The ring wasn't wrong. The woman wearing it was just the one they had chosen all along. I looked at myself in the mirror of my car, seeing a woman who had given her youth, her health, and her heart to a group of parasites. That deep, simmering resentment started to transform into something else. It wasn't just pain anymore. It was a cold, hard clarity. I realized that the discipline I learned in the army wasn't meant to be used for their benefit. It was meant to be the weapon I used to save myself. I would never let them walk over me again. Seeing Heidi stand in that cold Philadelphia night, realizing she literally paid for the ring her sister is now wearing to steal her husband, it just breaks my heart. We have all felt like the one who gives too much while others just take, haven't we? If you have ever felt like the scapegoat or the one left out in the cold by your own blood, please let Heidi know she isn't alone. Leave a heart or just the word truth in the comments to show your support for her. Your engagement helps us keep telling these stories of resilience and strength. Please like and comment to stand with her as she begins to fight back. I climbed the 4 flights of stairs to our apartment with a heavy bag of Italian takeout clutched in my hand, the weight of the pasta and breadsticks pulling at my tired arm. I was still wearing my uniform, the fabric feeling like a second skin that I was desperate to shed. My mind was a chaotic storm of denial, replay, and a fragile, pathetic hope that refused to die. I kept telling myself that the scene at the Bryn Mawr mansion had been a hallucination, or perhaps a cruel, elaborate test orchestrated by Susan to see if I would crack under pressure. I imagined Logan waiting for me behind our front door, ready to catch me in his arms and explain that his mother had forced his hand, that he was terrified and trapped, and that we would find a way to fix this together. I was ready to forgive him, ready to dismantle our life and rebuild it piece by piece if it meant I didn't have to face the truth of his betrayal. But as I reached the landing and extended my hand toward the brass doorknob, a familiar, cloying scent stopped me in my tracks. It was Margaret's perfume, a cheap floral musk that she had worn since high school, a scent that now felt like a toxic leak seeping through the cracks of the doorframe. The air in the hallway suddenly felt thin and frigid, and the bag of food in my hand became a leaden weight, a symbol of a domestic life that was already dead before I could even step inside. When I pushed the door open, the sight that met my eyes was far worse than any nightmare I had conjured on the stairs. A trail of clothes led from the entryway into the living room, a messy, frantic path that spoke of an intimacy that had long since bypassed any boundaries of respect or decency. I saw Margaret's silk blouse draped carelessly over the arm of the sofa, and right there on the rug lay the silk tie I had saved up to buy Logan for his first big presentation at the firm. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, irregular beat that felt like a drum of war echoing in a hollow canyon. I walked toward the bedroom, every step feeling like I was wading through deep, freezing water. When I reached the doorway, the world as I knew it simply ceased to exist. There, on the bed we had shared for years, was my olive drab military blanket, the one I had carried with me through every deployment. the one that had kept me warm in the freezing desert nights and served as my only piece of home in the middle of a conflict zone. It was a sacred object to me, a symbol of my survival and my honor. And there were Logan and my sister entangled beneath it, using my history and my sacrifice as a backdrop for their treachery. It wasn't just a physical betrayal, it was a desecration of everything I stood for, a calculated strike at the very heart of my identity. Margaret didn't even have the decency to look startled. She sat up, pulling my blanket around her shoulders with a practiced, smug grace, and began to smooth her hair as if I were nothing more than an uninvited guest who had arrived early for a party. She looked at me with a cold, triumphant light in her eyes, a look that told me she had been waiting for this moment of total conquest for a very long time. "You were always so busy being a soldier, Heidi," she said, her voice dripping with a casual cruelty that made my blood run cold. "You were always in the barracks, even when you were standing right here." Logan didn't need a drill sergeant or a provider. He needed a real partner who understood the world he lives in now. I looked at Logan, waiting for him to say something, to defend me, or to at least look me in the eye. But he just sat there, staring at the floor, his silence a louder confession of his cowardice than any words could have been. He looked small and pathetic, a man who had traded a lifetime of loyalty for a moment of easy comfort. The final blow came when Margaret reached for her purse on the nightstand and pulled out a thick envelope. "The lawyers have already drafted the papers," she said. "We thought it would be easier if everything was ready for you to sign." They were treating my marriage like a business contract that had reached its expiration date, a liability they were eager to write off so they could move on to their next investment. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in on the three of us until I could barely breathe. Logan finally found his voice, though it was a weak, trembling thing that barely carried across the room. "I think it would be best if you left tonight, Heidi," he whispered, still unable to meet my gaze. "We need the space to figure out the logistics of how we are going to move forward." The sheer audacity of his words felt like a physical strike. This was the apartment that my paychecks had secured, the home that my deployments had funded while he was still struggling to find his footing in the corporate world. I was being evicted from my own life by the very people who had feasted on my hard work for years. I looked at my stained military blanket, feeling a wave of nausea and a burning, white-hot anger that I had to fight to keep under control. I wanted to scream, to tear the room apart, to demand the justice that I knew would never come from them. But the soldier in me took over, the part of me that knew when a position was no longer tenable and when the only option left was a strategic withdrawal. I stood up straight, my chin held high, and looked at the two of them with a clarity that felt like ice in my veins. I didn't take the food. I didn't take my clothes. I simply turned and walked away from the wreckage of my past. I left the apartment with nothing but the uniform on my back and a fire in my soul that I knew would eventually burn their entire world down. I was retreating, but I wasn't defeated. I was just clearing the battlefield so I could choose the next one on my own terms. I stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by nothing but the ghosts of the life I had built here. The apartment was quiet, a hollow, echoing shell where my home used to be. Logan had left early that morning, taking far more than just his clothes. He had taken the leather sofa I had saved for, the large television I bought with my combat bonus, and even the rugs that covered the hardwood floors. He didn't just take the valuables, he took every shred of evidence that I had ever been a priority in his life. I looked at the walls, seeing the rectangular shadows where our wedding photos and framed unit citations once hung. Those pale outlines looked like open wounds on the dry wall, reminding me of everything that had been stripped away. My existence in Philadelphia was being packed into 8 green military crates, the same ones that had followed me across 3 continents. There were no tears left to fall as I pulled the packing tape across the cardboard, the sharp screeching sound of the adhesive filling the silence like a desperate cry for help. He had left behind the things he considered beneath him. A dented microwave that hummed too loudly and a stack of chipped ceramic plates we had bought at a flea market. To him, these items were as disposable and unremarkable as he now considered me to be. The sense of isolation was a physical weight, a burden I carried alone as I prepared to retreat from a battlefield I no longer recognized. Before I could truly leave, there was one final objective I had to face. I drove out to Bryn Mawr, the tires of my old car humming against the asphalt as I approached the massive iron gates of the family estate. I found Susan in her garden, wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat and expensive leather gloves as she meticulously pruned her prize-winning roses. She didn't even look up when I approached, her focus entirely on the delicate petals. She told me that I was simply too rigid for Logan's soul, her voice as calm and indifferent as if she were commenting on the weather. In the world of the Philadelphia elite, my discipline was viewed as a lack of refinement, and my unwavering loyalty was seen as a barrier to their social climbing. She spoke of me like an old piece of equipment that had exceeded its warranty, something to be discarded so the new model could take its place. I didn't argue or try to defend my character. I stood there like a soldier observing an enemy position, committing every line of her arrogant face to my memory. I realized then that my value never depended on their recognition. I returned to the empty apartment one last time, the air feeling colder now that the last of the crates were loaded into my car. I walked into the bedroom, looking at the bare mattress where Logan used to sleep. Instead of leaving a long, angry letter filled with the grievances that were burning in my chest, I took a small piece of scrap paper and wrote 5 short words. Watch me succeed. I placed the note exactly where his head used to rest, a simple command I was giving to myself more than him. It was the first order of my new mission. I walked down to the lobby and tossed the apartment keys into the trash bin near the entrance. The sound of the metal hitting the bottom was final, a sharp click that signaled the end of my life as a wife and a sister. In that moment, I was technically homeless and unemployed. But for the first time in years, I felt the terrifying, exhilarating rush of true freedom. I was no longer a shield for people who didn't care if I broke. I was an independent force once again. My journey began on Interstate 70, the long stretch of highway that cuts through the heart of the country like a silver ribbon. Philadelphia was a glowing speck in my rearview mirror, a city full of history and betrayal that I was more than happy to leave behind. Ahead of me lay the dark, looming shapes of the Rocky Mountains, a distant horizon that promised nothing but cold air and hard work. I drove for hours in silence, the rhythm of the road helping to drown out the echoes of Susan's insults and Logan's cowardice. I stopped at dusty rest areas to eat cheap burgers and slept in the driver's seat of my car for a few hours at a time, protecting my meager savings with the same intensity I used to guard a perimeter. Every mile I covered felt like a baptism, a way to wash away the false warmth of a family that had never truly seen me. The pain was still there, throbbing like an unhealed wound in the center of my chest, but the fire of my resolve was starting to burn brighter than the hurt. Denver didn't have a welcome mat waiting for me, and I knew the climb would be steep and lonely. But as the sun began to rise over the plains, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, I knew I was ready. I was heading into a new theater of operations, and this time, I was the commanding officer of my own life. Denver greeted me with a biting wind that cut through my thin coat and a stack of automated rejection emails that arrived with rhythmic cruelty. It didn't care about the medals in my crates or the years I'd spent defending a country that now seemed to have no place for me. I remember sitting in a glass-walled office in a skyscraper that touched the clouds, the air smelling of expensive espresso and practiced arrogance. A recruiter, a kid who looked like he had never seen a day of hardship in his life, flipped through my resume with a smirk that made my skin crawl. He called my background combat heavy, his voice dripping with a condescending tone that made my service sound like a social liability. He looked at the photo of me in my dress blues as if he were examining a strange, obsolete relic from a museum. He told me I lacked flexibility and that my military mindset might be too rigid for their fast-paced, creative environment. I sat there, my spine as straight as a bayonet, watching him dismiss a decade of leadership and logistics as if it were nothing more than a series of chores. These people have no idea what it takes to keep a unit alive and functioning in a war zone. They think creativity is a colorful slide deck, while I know it's finding a way to move tons of equipment through a mountain pass under fire with zero room for error. To them, I was just a machine that only knew how to follow orders. And in their world of soft power and strategic pivots, a machine was the last thing they wanted. By the 35th day in Denver, the silence of my phone was broken only by the sound of my own hunger. My bank account had dwindled to less than $20, a number that stared back at me from the ATM screen like a death sentence. I stood in a supermarket aisle, my fingers trembling slightly as I picked up a loaf of bread that had been marked down because it was nearing its expiration date. I calculated every cent, weighing the necessity of a carton of milk against the need to save enough for a bus pass to my next interview. The physical ache in my stomach was sharp, but the hollow feeling in my chest was far worse. I found myself thinking about Margaret, picturing her in a five-star restaurant back in Philadelphia, laughing with Logan over a bottle of wine that cost more than my monthly rent. She was probably eating foie gras and telling her friends how much more peaceful life was without her rigid sister around. She had been right about one thing. I was too disciplined. My discipline was the only thing that kept me from picking up the phone and begging Susan for a scrap of the life they had stolen from me. But the pride of a soldier is a stubborn thing. I would rather starve in the cold shadows of the Rockies than crawl back to a family that viewed my honor as a defect. I was a soldier without a platoon, a commander without a base, but I was still standing. In the quiet, desperate hours of the night in my cheap motel room, Susan's voice haunted me like a lingering fever. Her words echoed against the peeling wallpaper, reminding me that she thought I should have stayed in the military, where people like me belonged. She had called me a cold, dry machine, and in the darkness, I began to wonder if she was right. I looked at myself in the cracked bathroom mirror, seeing the dark circles under my eyes and the way my clothes hung loosely on a frame that had been hardened by war, but was now being hollowed out by neglect. Was I truly incapable of existing in this polished corporate world? Was my strength actually a wall that kept me isolated from the very life I was trying to build? I saw a woman who was tired, a woman who was lonely. But I also saw the same sharp, unyielding gaze that had guided me through the worst days of my life. They wanted me to believe that I was useless outside of a uniform, that my value ended when I stepped off the base. But a soldier only fails when they surrender their will to fight, and I hadn't even begun to charge. I realized then that I didn't need to change who I was to fit their world. I needed to make their world realize why they needed someone like me. My final chance came in the form of a call from Pinnacle Marketing. It was an entry-level executive assistant position, a role that was technically beneath my experience, but was the only lifeline I had left before I was forced onto the streets. I spent the morning ironing my only suit with a travel iron, meticulously pressing the desperation out of the fabric until the creases were sharp enough to draw blood. I walked into the office of Nathan Cross with the mindset of an officer entering enemy territory to negotiate a ceasefire. The office was a sea of glass and steel, filled with people who moved with a frantic, uncoordinated energy. Nathan Cross was a man who looked like he appreciated efficiency, his desk organized with a mathematical precision that I recognized instantly. I sat across from him, not as a victim looking for a handout, but as a professional presenting a strategic asset. I didn't try to hide my military background or soften my tone to make them feel more comfortable. I looked him directly in the eye and told him that while his team might be creative, they lacked the logistical discipline to turn their ideas into a reality. I told him that my rigidity was the very thing that would keep his projects from falling apart when the pressure mounted. I wasn't there to be loved. I was there to be indispensable. As I left that office, I felt the first spark of real hope I'd felt since leaving Philadelphia. The corporate world thought they had rejected a soldier, but they were about to find out they had invited a commander through the front door. Nathan Cross's office was a different kind of war zone, one that lacked the smell of gunpowder but carried the heavy stench of failed systems and exhausted genius. Papers were strewn across his mahogany desk like shrapnel from a filing cabinet explosion, and half-empty coffee cans sat in clusters like abandoned outposts. Nathan didn't look at me with the practiced contempt of my mother-in-law, Susan, or the calculated dismissal of the recruiters I'd faced earlier. Instead, he looked at me with the desperate curiosity of a man who was drowning in his own creation. I stood before him in my pressed suit, my posture a stark contrast to the slumped shoulders of his creative team. He leaned back in his chair and asked me why a decorated soldier would ever want to step into the fickle world of marketing. I didn't give him a rehearsed speech about passion or career pivots. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that the business world was failing because it lacked the discipline to turn bright ideas into actual profit. I told him that I was not just an assistant, I was the order that his chaos demanded. I told him I was the discipline that would save his company. I began my new mission by treating that disorganized office like a logistical command center. I started implementing standard operating procedures, or SOPs, for every moving part of the business, applying the same precision I'd used to coordinate troop movements in a combat zone. The creative staff, who had spent months wandering through meetings without agendas, suddenly found themselves working to a precise clock. I coordinated schedules and managed personnel with the unwavering focus of a supply officer. One late night, after the glass towers of Denver had begun to glow against the dark sky, Nathan stopped by my desk and asked why I was still at my post. I told him that excellence requires follow-through, not just convenience. I was not just doing a job, I was issuing a declaration of independence to my own life. That conversation was not just about spreadsheets. It was a vow I was making to myself that I would never again be the victim of someone else's lack of structure. As the weeks turned into months, Nathan began to realize that my talents extended far beyond organizing his calendar. He started pulling me into high-level strategy sessions, and I quickly discovered that the intelligence gathering and target analysis skills I had honed in the military were perfectly suited for dismantling consumer psychology. Every marketing plan I drafted felt like I was positioning artillery for a final strike against the arrogance of those who had discarded me. I was no longer the silent, suffering wife or the overlooked daughter-in-law. I was a strategist, sharpening my weapons in the high-altitude shadows of Denver while waiting for the perfect moment to return to Philadelphia and reclaim the dignity they tried to strip away from me. I was not just working for a paycheck anymore. I was building an empire of my own making, fueled by the very rigidity that Susan and Logan had mocked. The turning point came on a Tuesday night when an email from Margaret pinged on my phone. It was an invitation to a gala they were hosting, a flashy display of the wealth and status they had stolen from me. She even included a small note about how they were finally happy now that the tension had left their home. I looked at that email, and the anger that had once burned like a chaotic wildfire suddenly cooled into a solid, sharp block of ice. I did not cry. I did not feel the urge to call and scream. I simply deleted the message without a single tremor in my hand. That email was meant to break me, but instead it served as the final confirmation that I had outgrown them. I stood by the office window, looking out at the city lights that glittered like loaded weapons ready to fire. I was no longer the broken woman who had been evicted from her own life on a cold Philadelphia night. I was a leader in the making, a commander of my own destiny. And I knew that the final battle would be fought on a stage I controlled. The silence of the office around me felt like the quiet before a major offensive. I had spent years protecting people who did not value me, and now I was finally using that strength to protect myself. I realized that the family I'd left behind was still playing checkers while I was moving pieces on a global board. Every project I successfully launched at Pinnacle was a nail in the coffin of their low expectations. I was no longer hiding from my past. I was using it as fuel. I whispered a promise to the empty room that they would see me succeed. And when that day came, I would not be looking back for their approval. I was ready to lead, I was ready to follow my own path, and I was certainly ready for anyone in my way to step aside. This is Harper Vance. Watching Heidi find her voice in that chaotic Denver office gives me chills. We have all been in that position where someone tells us our greatest strength is actually a weakness, haven't we? They called her dry and rigid, but that is exactly what saved Nathan and gave Heidi her power back. If you are cheering for Heidi as she sharpens her weapons for the final showdown, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment with the word command or just a lightning bolt emoji to show you are standing with her. Your support means everything to this story. Please like and share this video to help us spread Heidi's message of resilience. Together we can show the world that a warrior's spirit can never truly be broken. Nathan pushed a thick folder across the heavy oak desk in our Denver office, the sound of paper sliding against wood echoing in the quiet room. This was not just a collection of financial reports or a routine update on our latest acquisitions. It was a new set of marching orders. He looked at me with a level of respect that I had never experienced in my life before coming to this city. He didn't see an assistant who managed his calendar or a subordinate who followed instructions without question. He saw a peer, a co-commander of the empire we were building together. He told me that my iron discipline and my ability to see through the chaos of the marketplace were weapons that this industry rarely saw in its leaders. In that moment, standing in the sunlight that streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I realized I was no longer the discarded soldier lost in a world that didn't want her. I was a leader establishing her own territory, a woman who had turned her supposed flaws into her greatest strategic assets. We sat down to finalize the formation of Cross Morgan Creative, a partnership built on a foundational promise to always have each other's six. A term from my past that Nathan had adopted with a sincerity that moved me more than I cared to admit. It was the first time I felt like part of a real team, where loyalty was not a tool for exploitation, but a sacred bond that strengthened us both. While our company flourished in the thin, crisp air of the Rockies, the intelligence reports from Philadelphia began to arrive with increasing frequency. Hartwell Consulting, the house of cards that Margaret and Logan had built on the ruins of my marriage and the money I had sacrificed, was swaying at its foundation. Their lack of financial discipline and their blind ambition for social standing had left them drowning in a sea of debt they couldn't possibly navigate. I read through the reports of Margaret's frantic mismanagement and Logan's desperate attempts to keep up appearances with a strange, quiet calm. They had once mocked my rigidity as a defect of my character, but now it was the very lack of it that was pulling them into the abyss. I started gathering every scrap of evidence, every missed payment, and every fraudulent claim they had made to stay afloat. I didn't do it out of a petty need for harm. I did it with the cold, professional detachment of an auditor. I was documenting the inevitable collapse of an undisciplined unit that had overestimated its own cleverness. Their chaos was the direct result of their own choices, and I was simply preparing to show the world the reality behind their polished facade. Nathan approached me later that week, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant as he leaned against the doorframe. He offered to cancel our acquisition of Meridian, the parent company that held Hartwell Consulting's fate in its hands, if the move made me uncomfortable. He was giving me an out, a way to avoid the confrontation that had been 6 years in the making. But the soldier in me wouldn't allow for a retreat when the primary objective was finally in sight. I looked up from my monitor, my gaze steady and my voice as cold as the winter wind outside. I told him that this was strictly business, a strategic move to absorb the remnants of a failing competitor and strengthen our own position in the market. I wasn't the woman who had been kicked out of her own home on a cold night with nothing but the clothes on her back. I was the CEO of Mediavance, the woman holding the power of life and death over the careers of the people who had once tried to destroy mine. Every step I took was calculated with the precision of a tactical officer preparing for a major engagement. The upcoming gala in Philadelphia wasn't just another social event on the calendar. It was the designated drop zone for the truth that I was bringing back with me. 6 years had passed since the night I walked away from the wreckage of my old life, and between the lines of brilliant financial projections and successful campaigns, Nathan found a moment to change our lives forever. Surrounded by the quiet hum of our successful office, he knelt down and asked me to marry him. He didn't offer the empty, flowery promises that Logan had used to mask his cowardice and his lies. He offered a commitment to an unbreakable alliance, a promise of loyalty that had already been proven in the trenches of the business world we had conquered together. He told me that a marriage was simply the formalization of the partnership we had already built, a union where respect and discipline were the cornerstones. I said yes, not because I needed a protector or a place to hide, but because I had finally found a home where my strength was not a liability, but a gift. As I looked toward the horizon, toward the city of Philadelphia that I had once fled in shame, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in a decade. The shadows of my past were still there, but they were about to be burned away by the light of the truth I was carrying home. The final battle was approaching, and this time, I was the one who controlled the battlefield. The Philadelphia Museum of Art was transformed into a sea of shimmering lights and whispered power for the evening's gala, its grand stone pillars standing as silent witnesses to the city's elite. I stepped out of the black sedan and onto the red carpet, the cool night air pressing against my skin. I wasn't wearing my uniform tonight, but I felt more like a soldier than I ever had in a trench. I was draped in an emerald green gown, the silk heavy and perfectly tailored, cutting a silhouette that was as sharp and unforgiving as a ceremonial blade. Behind me stood Nathan, his presence a steady, unspoken oath of loyalty that anchored me in this world of polished glass and hidden agendas. As we entered the great stair hall, the hum of conversation momentarily faltered. I could feel the weight of 100 gazes, but I didn't look down. I scanned the room with the practiced precision of a commander surveying a battlefield. In a far corner, near the champagne tower, I spotted them: Susan, Margaret, and Logan. They looked small, their expensive clothes unable to hide the frantic, hollow energy that seemed to radiate from their huddle. Susan's face, usually a mask of aristocratic boredom, turned a sickly shade of gray as her eyes met mine. She didn't see the crude, unrefined girl she had cast out 6 years ago. She saw the CEO who now held the keys to her family's survival. Nathan and I moved through the crowd with a deliberate, controlled grace, every handshake and nod a strategic move on a board they didn't even realize was in play. Margaret, ever the opportunist, tried to break away from her group to intercept Nathan as we neared the center of the room. She wore a smile that was as bright and artificial as the jewelry she had stolen from me, her eyes darting toward him with a desperate, predatory hunger. She began to offer a practiced compliment about his recent successes, her voice dripping with the same syrup she'd used to lure Logan away. But Nathan didn't give her the opening she expected. He stopped, his hand finding the small of my back in a gesture of absolute possession and partnership. He didn't look at Margaret, he looked at the room, his voice projecting with a clarity that cut through the background noise. He told the gathered leaders of Philadelphia that every success our firm had achieved was due to the brilliant, tactical command of my partner Heidi. He spoke of my discipline and my strategic vision as the rarest and most valuable assets in the modern market. It was a direct strike against the very foundation of the lies Susan had built. I watched the mask of the successful businesswoman crumble on Margaret's face, replaced by a raw, naked humiliation that no amount of silk could cover. The climax of the evening arrived not with a speech, but with the sudden illumination of the massive LED screens lining the hall. The announcement of our acquisition of Meridian scrolled across the displays in bold, uncompromising letters. I stood perfectly still as the room erupted in applause, the sound of their approval feeling like a final, decisive victory. But the real blow was in the details listed below the merger. There, for all the elite of the city to see, were the names of Logan and Margaret, listed not as partners or executives, but as junior staff members absorbed into the lower tiers of my command structure. They were now officially working for the woman they had treated as trash. I saw Logan's shoulders slump as he realized the magnitude of his defeat. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the true face of the man I had once loved. A small, frightened coward who had traded his honor for a status he couldn't even maintain on his own. The power dynamic had been reset with a brutal, cold finality, and it had been done right here, in the heart of their own hollow world. Later, I stepped onto the quiet balcony overlooking the city lights to find Susan standing there, her hands trembling as she gripped the stone railing. She tried to salvage a scrap of her pride, her voice shaking as she told me she always knew my military discipline would lead to something great. I looked at her with the same detached contempt I would show a surrendering enemy who had lost all claim to dignity. There was no hatred left in me, only a deep, profound sense of relief that I no longer belonged to her world. When Margaret followed her out, trying to launch one last desperate insult about me only succeeding because of the man I had married, I didn't let the words land. I looked her in the eye and told her that what Nathan and I had was a strategic alliance, a union where we challenged and elevated one another. I told her it was something she would never understand because she had chosen a deserter who was only capable of taking, never building. I turned my back on them and walked toward the light of the gala, leaving them in the ruins of their own making. The battle was over, the objective was secured, and for the first time in my life, I was breathing air that was truly my own. When the gala lights finally flickered out and the echoes of the city elite faded into the Philadelphia night, I found myself back in Denver, sitting alone in my living room overlooking the silhouette of the Rocky Mountains. The thrill of the calculated takeover and the public vindication had begun to settle into something much more quiet and heavy. I had expected the taste of victory to be sweet, like a long-awaited reward after a grueling deployment, but instead it felt like a hollow, vast emptiness. I realized then that taking over their company and exposing their weakness didn't automatically mend the jagged scars they had left on my soul years ago at that dinner table. I reached for a new military blanket I'd recently purchased. It was crisp, clean, and carried no weight of the past. Wrapping it around my shoulders, I felt the stark difference from the old one that had been stained by their betrayal. True triumph, I discovered, wasn't found in watching them suffer or grovel in their own mismanagement. It was found in the quiet realization that they no longer possessed the power to make me bleed, that their words and actions could never reach the core of who I had become. The silence of my new life was soon interrupted by a long, rambling letter from Logan. It was filled with desperate apologies and a pathetic plea to start over, claiming he had been blinded by his mother's manipulation and Margaret's ambition. He tried to evoke memories of our early years, hoping to find a soft spot in the woman he had once evicted. I read his words with the steady, unblinking heart of a person who had survived a storm and no longer feared the rain. There was no surging anger, no desire to scream back across the miles. I didn't reply with a letter of my own. Instead, I sent a cold, precise legal agreement that drew a permanent line between our professional interaction and our non-existent private lives. I accepted the permanent fracture of our relationship not out of a lingering grudge, but as a necessary act of strategic defense for my own soul. He had chosen to desert me when I was at my lowest, and now the border between us was closed for good. Susan attempted to breach that perimeter as well, calling me under the guise of family reconciliation and moving past old grievances for the sake of appearances. I didn't engage in the debate. I simply blocked her number and moved on. It was a profound realization to finally understand that blood does not automatically grant someone a seat at your table, nor does it entitle them to your peace. Blood relations are just biology. A real family is built on the foundation of mutual respect and the fierce protection of one another's dignity. Nathan and Caroline were the allies who had marched with me through the Valley of Shadows when I had nothing but a few crates to my name. I no longer felt the crushing weight of guilt for letting go of the people who had given me life, only to try and extinguish it. The greatest liberty I'd earned through this long campaign was the absolute right to choose exactly who gets to share my space and my time. Standing before the mirror that evening, I looked at the psychological scars that remained. They were still there, etched into the way I carried my shoulders and the caution in my eyes, but they were no longer raw or bleeding. I chose to see them as my own medals of survival, evidence of a war fought and won on my own terms. The cruelty of my biological family had forced me to become unyielding, and in that process I had defined my own value without waiting for their permission. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the scent of the Colorado pines fill my lungs, a scent of freedom and high-altitude clarity. The past had been processed and filed away. My present was fortified by a circle of trust, and the future was a vast, open territory waiting for me to write its next chapter. I was finally at peace with the silence. The sunrise in Denver does not carry the suffocating weight of Philadelphia. Instead, it brings the crisp scent of pine needles and the pure, biting air that rolls off the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains. I stood on the balcony of my home, my fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug of hot black coffee. A lingering habit from my years in uniform that I found no reason to discard. Back then, the caffeine was a necessity to stay alert during the long, lonely hours of a night watch. But today, I drank it to savor the stillness of my own success. I looked down at the city below as it slowly flickered to life, knowing that the heart of the Cross Morgan creative empire was beating strong under my command. The very discipline that Susan had once spat upon as dry and unrefined had become the bedrock of this prosperity. A soft smile touched my lips as I felt a deep, steady peace settling into every breath I took. It was a quiet, hard-earned happiness that I had manually forged from the cold ashes of betrayal and the wreckage of a life I once thought was permanent. In the afternoon, I made my way to the Veterans Support Center that Nathan and I had established a few years ago. As I walked through the halls, I saw the faces of young men and women who were struggling to navigate the confusing terrain of civilian life. And in their eyes, I saw the reflection of the woman I was 6 years ago, abandoned, rejected, and told she had no place in the world she was trying to join. I don't just teach these soldiers the mechanics of marketing or the logistics of business. I teach them how to sharpen their military discipline until it becomes a formidable weapon in the boardroom. I sat with a group of them today and shared the story of a woman who was cast out of her own home on a cold night because her family viewed her strength as an obsolete defect. I watched the fire of hope catch in their eyes as they realized that their identity was not a liability. This center is my true legacy. It is not measured by the soaring numbers on a financial report or the prestige of my title, but by the moment these men and women realize that their value is something they define for themselves, far beyond the reach of those who would try to diminish them. As I was leaving the center, a brief economic notification appeared on my phone, a digital ghost from the city I left behind. The Philadelphia Inquirer was reporting that Hartwell Consulting had officially filed for bankruptcies following a devastating string of financial audits and internal failures. The names Logan, Margaret, and Susan were now permanently tethered to the public collapse of their reputation and the evaporation of the status they had worshipped above all else. I didn't feel a surge of wild, vindictive joy as I read the headlines. Instead, I felt a strange, gentle pity for people who had traded the unwavering loyalty of a sister and a wife for the hollow, transient glitter of social climbing. They had been given the chance to have a soldier standing guard over their future, but they chose a path of shallow deception that eventually consumed them. I turned off the screen and felt the final door to my past click shut. They were no longer enemies to be defeated or obstacles to be overcome. They were merely small fading specks in the rearview mirror of a life that had moved far beyond their narrow horizon. That evening, as the shadows of the mountains stretched across the valley, Nathan found me in my study and wrapped his arms around me from behind. His warmth was the living confirmation of what it means to have a family that you choose, a sanctuary built on the foundation of shared respect and absolute trust. He never asked me to soften the edges of my personality or to hide the scars I carry from my time in the field. He loved the woman who had been hardened by war and refined by fire. I reached into the back of my desk drawer and pulled out a tattered, yellowed piece of paper that had lived in my wallet for half a decade. On it were the 5 words I had scribbled in a moment of absolute desperation. Watch me succeed. I lit a single candle and held the corner of the paper to the flame, watching as the fire slowly consumed the ink and the parchment. The mission was finally, excellently complete. I no longer felt the need to prove my worth to people who were never capable of seeing it in the first place, because I had finally proven it to the only person whose judgment mattered, myself. I am Heidi Morgan, a veteran, a leader, and at long last, a woman who is loved completely for exactly who she is. My true dawn has finally begun. Heidi's journey serves as a powerful reminder that your value is an internal constant, never a variable determined by those who fail to recognize it. When the people closest to you attempt to label your greatest strengths as flaws, it is a reflection of their own limitations, not yours. The discipline, resilience, and integrity you forge during your hardest seasons are not just survival tools. They are the blueprints for your future empire. True empowerment begins the moment you stop seeking validation from toxic environments and start investing in your own growth and a chosen family that honors your scars. Thank you so much for standing with Heidi through every betrayal and every victory. Her story is a testament to the fact that it is never too late to redefine your legacy and reclaim your dignity. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to set a difficult boundary to protect your peace? Or have you found a chosen family that supported you when you had nothing? Please share your experiences or even just a word of encouragement in the comments below. Your stories inspire this community and remind us all that we are never truly alone. If Heidi's path to peace touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to support more stories of resilience and restoration.